Welcome to Let's Talk Death, conversations to inform and inspire. Let's Talk Death is a series of conversations with some amazing people from various fields. Our goal through these conversations is to normalize, educate, and demystify the taboo around death, dying, and the journey of grief. Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we are thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Zander Masser. Zander is an occupational therapist, husband, father, musician, and author of the narrative photography book, Unburying My Father. Zander's father, Randy, contracted HIV from contaminated blood products to treat his hemophilia and died in 2000 from AIDS-related illnesses. Zander, at the time, was a young 14-year-old boy. 20 years later, Zander unburied 10,000 slides from Randy's career as a professional photographer, which prompted him to dig deeper into his father's life. What started as a photography project evolved into a transformative exploration of living with and healing from grief. Zander, we are delighted to have you on our show.
Very delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Zander. Before we speak about your book, your work, your journey, may I first take you back to when you were that 15-year-old boy whose father died? What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start by just talking about the night he died. I remember vividly, and I write about this in the book, sitting in his hospital room and kind of sitting on his bed and holding his hand. And he had so many medications and drugs in him, and he was so ill that he couldn't really converse with me. And he was kind of like, his eyes were opening and closing. And, this is a memory I can just step into so easily. And the last thing I said to him was that I love you. And he wasn't able to respond, but I do believe that he heard me. And when I stepped out of the room, my mom was there. My mom, myself, and my brother each took a minute to ourselves with him. And she asked me if I was afraid that he was going to die. And I said yes. And I gave her a hug and I cried. And that was the first time she ever asked me that question. And I bring that up because we knew my father was sick for a long time. And while I did have that fear, no one had ever asked me that before until the night he died. So I'll start with that. But after that, it's a difficult question to ask. What was it like? But it was so incredibly difficult, painful. And I remember the first few thoughts and feelings after I found out he died the next morning was that I just couldn't see a path forward. I didn't understand how I would be able to live my life. And obviously I have, but in those moments and on that morning, those were at the fleeting moments that I was actually able to think at all. That's what went through my head.
Well, even thank you for sharing your story. I know that many of our listeners will connect with that, maybe even having similar experiences. And so often, a lot of the work that I've done with kids is how often kids have to keep all of that stays to themselves. Like people don't ask typically. And so it becomes not just a difficult journey, but also an isolated journey for so many kids. along the way. Yeah.
I think too, as a kid, it was the beginning of my adolescence, which is a particularly hard time for anybody. But it was, extra hard to go through that at that age. But like you were saying, nobody asks. And at least when I was a kid, I wasn't encouraged to talk about it. And it wasn't modeled in my family. We didn't talk about what we kind of knew was going to happen. It was never talked about. But then after he died, it's like I spent years being shown that we stay silent or we have our own internal experiences. But then after he died, I was pushed into therapy and bereavement groups and asked to then, in a state of basically shock and mourning and really intense grief, to then open up and start talking about it. And it didn't work for me. I subsequently over the years, some therapy has worked, but in those years and those times, I wasn't ready, I wasn't available, and I wasn't willing to share. And, only in retrospect, after going through the project that I've created, did I realize how unfair that was and how unfair it feels now looking back.
Yeah. It's interesting how people around us think they know what's best for us in those moments. But again, they don't even ask us those things. So it's not only not asking us about the person, but it's assuming what we need and then thrusting us into that, right? As opposed to really, and of course, I mean, quite frankly, we probably don't even know what we need at that moment either. But we definitely, when we get into the midst of something, we certainly know that this is not it. Like we know what it is not by the things that surround us.
Yeah. And I think too, like after my experience of after he died set me on I think a trajectory, at least it contributed to my trajectory, which was that after he died, so much of the focus of whatever services I was receiving or whatever healing was being attempted was how to cope with death. And what really got lost, I think, was my father's life. We didn't talk about his life enough. And that set me on a path of almost 20 years of a constant churning and processing of what does it mean? What does my dad's death mean? How has it impacted me? And how does it influence my life? And this project that I've done, this book that I've written, Unburying My Father, is a complete pivot to life. And as I learned about my father's life and his story unfolded, I came to realize that my father's life had so much more of an impact on me than his death. But I didn't know about his life. I was 14 when he died. We didn't have adult conversations, and that's a whole other theme about him not sharing with me. But as I learned about him and as people shared stories about him, I was like, oh, that's me. You're telling a story about my dad, but that can be me. And it was so beautiful and amazing to have these kinds of experiences of hearing stories like that. And it's completely shifted my focus. And, when I say transformative, that's what I mean, is that it has transformed how I view my grief, my father's life compared to his death. And yeah, it's been an amazing, beautiful journey that this book has taken me on.
Interesting you say that. We quite often have members that come into our community that have been bereaved maybe 5-10 years and are really starting to seek that journey about who their person was, especially if their person had died when they were in adolescence or as a young adult. They reach those milestones of self-identity and who are they and where did they come from, that they really seek to learn the life the person led, more so than the journey of their grief. So it's really what you said really resonates with what we've heard.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that, which is that one of the most incredible parts of relearning and learning about my father is, as I was doing so much outreach, I reached out to probably somewhere between 40 and 50 people. And I asked for stories about my dad, specifically stories, I didn't want them to like describe my dad. I wanted to hear their memories of him. And one of the amazing results and outcomes of this is that it allowed me to realize, and this especially solidified when I had all these stories from other people, then I started sharing my own story, realized how not isolated I am or was, because there were so many other people who were also experiencing my father's life and death and still grieving him. And so as I lived 20 years in isolation, because that's what I put myself through, I realized that I didn't have to do that. And it was just like this incredible thing. And then to put it in a book, it turned it into this metaphor where it's like, here's a highly personal story, but it's also highly collective. There's 40 people that sent me stories. There's about 20 or so that are published in the book. And I'm just a part of it. I'm an important part of it, but there's a lot of people, and that was really powerful for me.
The title, to me, it's a striking title, and it's, I think it's a brilliant title, really. I'm curious how you came about with the title, like, how you came up with the title. Was it you woke up one morning and went, I've got the title, or was it, was there just a kind of a transition to the title, or how did that come about? I'm curious.
Well, I actually remember the moment that I came up with it, which was in discussion with my wife, who's been a really big part of this project too. We were hiking on a mountain in upstate New York, and which is often where we would have a lot of our really good creative discussions about this project. And it just kind of came to us because, firstly, the project started with me literally unburying my father's legacy in the form of his photography collection. 10 years after he died, my brother and I went into the basement of our childhood home, and we knew our dad was a photographer. Obviously, we grew up with his photos surrounding us on the walls, but we just wanted to go down there and see what was left or what he left behind. And I mean, it was an incredible body of work. And I could talk about his photography aside, but just unburying, literally, it was amongst stuff. 10,000 slides was the start of this whole thing. And I use the word unburying too, because I unburied his story that I never knew by reaching out to the people that knew him and loved him. And then what really surfaced is my story. I did not intend for this book to be about me in any way initially, but it became so much about me and my relationship with my dad. And this whole thing unfolded totally organically. I just wanted to share his photos because I think they're amazing. That's how this started. And it just turned into this whole other, there's like over 200 photos in the book, and he really was an immense talent. But along with the photos is really great written content about the story of his life and the story of my limited time with him and my experience of his death. And so there's just so much unburying that was done, has been done. And when you read the book, you see what's unburied as you go through. So that's kind of how that came about. And we were just on a mountain, and it just kind of like the word unburying just kept popping up over and over. And so that's how it came about.
Zander, I have a question. What was it like uncovering, going through those photos? What kind of emotions were coming up for you?
Honestly, going through the photos was very joyful for me. I experienced a lot of emotion in this project, a lot of sorrow, a lot of sadness, a lot of laughter, like in terms of the storytelling. But with the photos themselves, firstly, I just gained this appreciation for not only my father's prolific collection, but he was just unbelievably talented. And I think his photography is unique. I've never seen anything like it. But coupling that with the storytelling and learning about him, it allowed me to appreciate his photography so much more, because like I would hear or read a story about my dad, for example. He was a little kid and he was going to go to the Statue of Liberty with his cousin. And this is his cousin who told me the story. And my dad fell. They were playing outside the apartment and he fell and he hit his knee. And if, for those who are not familiar with hemophilia, one of the main symptoms is internal bleeding, and his knee like blew up like a balloon. And that was the first time that my dad's cousin realized that he had, a disease or an illness of any kind. And then as I'm going through the photos, I see these incredible photos of the Statue of Liberty. And this is kind of a literal example. There are also lots of metaphorical examples as well. But, I put myself in my dad's shoes when he's snapping that photo. And I'm wondering, one, is he consciously thinking about his past experience at the Statue of Liberty, or is it just ingrained in him? And there's some reason why he was drawn to that angle or to that moment to snap that photo. And in a more broad sense, I feel that his photography is very human when you look at it, or if you look at it. I describe it as deeply human. And I've come to realize that I think his photography was his way of processing his own grief, his own illnesses. He had a lot of challenges in his life that he didn't talk about. But I do believe that he used his creative talent and artistic talent to process whatever challenges he was going through. And so, there's that processing, and then there's the physical act of going through and archiving 10,000 slides, which I don't need to go into that, but it was a whole ton of work. But it was an amazing endeavor that I really enjoyed.
Interesting you say that about archiving. I embarked on a project almost 2 decades ago of taking every photograph I could get my hands on and scanning them into a computer. And it was right around the time where Faces on the Mac was just allowing you to now put faces into folders. So I have a folder for each of our family members of every photo I have my hands on with their face in it, into their photo.
Good for you. That is no small task.
No, it was. Now it's a lot easier because photos just recognize his faces. Yeah. But it was, I would say it was a several-year project that I embarked on 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
The importance.
It's a worthwhile endeavor. And if you go to my social media pages, which we can share whenever, I share a bunch about just the process of, what went behind and into creating this project. And there's a bunch about like the scanning and archiving of the photos.
One of the things over the years, I've spent a lot of time sitting with a lot of people over the years, just really, I call it sacred space. They let me into their story and they share their story, and how often so much of the story after a person's death is about their death. And you have this person who has, some people it's a very short life, some people it's a little longer, some people maybe longer than that, but there was life, and it takes some time sometimes for people to get to where they can reconnect with their person's life, because so much of their grief is, but they died and they're not here. And that's that's the big struggle part. But I've watched so many people that when they can reconnect with their life, and it seems like photos, writings, stories about them, those are things that can capture that piece. And so it was interesting to me when you said that your looking through the photos was a joyous, experience. And I've heard that from so many people, that when they're able to, there's a term that they use in the bereavement field called continuing bonds. And it's that idea of, for years in the bereavement field, we had people talking about the death and their grief and how do you work through and how do you cope. And more recently, we've started including, well, tell me about your person. Like, what is their story? How do you connect with them in that? What does that mean to you? And it's made a little bit of a shift in that more recently. And I can see where this work that you've put together will continue some of that movement that I think is important.
Yeah. And, looking back on my experience of loss when I was younger, I have felt disappointment that even, sitting in a therapy room, my therapist never said, tell me your dad's story.
Yeah.
And that felt like a missed opportunity. I do remember in a bereavement group, one of the few things I remember vividly and being very helpful was actually, well, it's not ironic, it's very apt, was creating a small piece of memorial art where we like created I think they called it like a memory cushion or something. And I would just grab like a few artifacts. Like I had my dad's tie and a photo and a couple other things, and we pinned them to these cushions. And I just remember, of all the grief work I did as a kid, that was the one that, I don't know, didn't suck. It like,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
use that term only because I think that's something I would have said as a kid. But that's how it felt. And so you talk about continued bonds, that's been a major outcome of my project, is that my father and I have a new relationship, one in which we're actually interdependent, because in order to share his photos, he needs me to tell the story. And in order to tell the story, I really need his photos. And so we really are dependent on each other now. And I'll add to that, which is that, this has been transformative for me, so much to the point where I felt not only compelled to publish this book, but to take that a step further. And I've created a grief workshop where I broke down my creative process into 10 steps. Each step is actionable. And at the end of the workshop, participants have a very concrete guide for how they can memorialize their person creatively. And I've done it a few times, and it's just been amazing. People have shared such great stories, and, it's led people onto their own paths of, whatever their art would look like. For me, it was a book, and it's turned into a few other things, but for other people, it's a dance or a meal or a trip, or it doesn't matter. It's whatever their creative leanings are, but it's facilitated, some great continuing bonds with people they've lost.
I love that. I can definitely see where that would be helpful to people. Because for many, many years in our Western culture, we were telling people that when someone dies, you break the bonds, you have to sever that relationship and move on and start new relationships. And really, until recently, when we recognize, wait a minute, it's a travesty, and we're not doing justice by people, and we're not helping people, because the natural inclination is to connect, not to disconnect.
Yeah. We often say that just because our person is no longer with us in physical presence, that doesn't mean our relationship ends. It just changes.
It can't.
Yeah.
You can say move on all you want, but you don't.
It's how do you take with?
Exactly.
We don't. That doesn't accurately reflect the human condition if we try to say that you move on, because we just don't. You're exactly right. Well, Zander, we're almost out of time, but our people like to connect with our guests, and I'm curious how might those who are listening in connect with you, with your work? How might they do that?
Sure. So the easiest thing would be to go to my website, which is randymasserphoto.com. Randy was my father's name. So the website features his photos. It's where they can pick up a copy of the book, but also on that site, there are links to contact me by email and also to my Facebook and Instagram pages. And through social media, I've done a lot of sharing about this project, but also just my grief journey in general. And yeah, so that's randymasserphoto.com. And feel free to shoot me an email or message. I always respond. And I hope you pick up a copy of the book, and I hope it helps you.
Zander, we want to thank you so much for being a guest here and Let's Talk Death and sharing the inspiration behind your work and your book and your story about healing.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really, real pleasure to speak with you.
And thank you to those who are joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward.
And if you know of a bereaved adult, refer them to our AMF app, where adults of all ages connect with others experiencing a similar death loss. And last, make sure to sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletters for links to future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
And again, we thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.